Well, happy Peikoff Wednesday, folks. Last Peikoff Wednesday of the year. I am hoping, I am trusting that y'all have been enjoying a fantastic holiday. Christmas is over, New Year's is right around the corner, and I have the pleasure of talking, and you have the pleasure of listening to James Valliant, author and philosopher extraordinaire. James, how are you doing on this final Peikoff Wednesday of 2022?
I'm doing well. I'm feeling some perspective on the year at this point, trying to take inventory of things as I normally do at this time of year, and trying to look forward to at least what my short and intermediate term goals are and my long-term goals and how I'm going to achieve them for the next. So this is a kind of a moment of reflection for me, and I hope a moment of reflection for our audience as we discuss the topic today.
Outstanding. And if anybody isn't already part of Gene Moroney's Thinking Labs, and even if you are, the ARCUK UK discussion on HBTV, Harry Binswanger television with Gene Moroney, talk about a perfect, since you mentioned you're wrapping up goals and goals coming up, couldn't do better than that discussion on Monday. Make sure you've watched that one or catch it if you haven't already. Speaking of the ARCUK, last chance, folks, at least on Peikoff Wednesdays, great shows are coming up, but your last chance on Peikoff Wednesdays, support the Ayn Rand Center UK. Love that we've already got a couple people in the chat, because I know we're up against Yaron Brooks today, but pshaw and to heck with that. Those of you in the chat, feel free to make your comments and questions stand out with a super chat, hit the $ there, and any money that you put in supports the Ayn Rand Center UK. You can also become a member, and there's a link right at the top of the chat there to become a member of the Ayn Rand Center UK. We're wrapping up 2022 with 4 eternal questions chosen by you, James Valliant. Meaty, beady, big and bouncy questions, if I can steal an expression from The Who. And I invite our friends and listeners in the chat to weigh in on these as well, because we're going to sow a little bit of controversy. And so I'm going to jump right in with question number 1. Leonard Peikoff was asked for his podcast series, Ayn Rand said that classical civilization did not have any real respect for the individual, and that it was Christianity that introduced the sanctity of the individual. Do you disagree? Now, I'll read a bit of Leonard Peikoff's perspective on this, but I'm especially interested to hear James Valliant on this, the author of Creating Christ, and I know you have a lot to say about this. But Leonard Peikoff started off his answer with, well, there is definitely a difference between what she said and what I have said, but I think there are 2 different aspects here. I was speaking on the level of individualism as a general philosophy, and I think in that sense, Greece was very individualistic. In metaphysics, for instance, Greeks believed in the reality of particulars, of concretes, whereas Christianity subsequently believed that individuals are not real. They're all aspects of Corpus Christi and reflections of God. In epistemology, the Greeks believed that each individual must be the judge of truth by his own mind, whereas in Christianity, people were taught faith and authority. One's individuality is nothing. He goes on and covers the branches of philosophy, and he refers back to the dim hypothesis. And then he says, I can't really speak for Ayn Rand, but I believe she was talking about the issue of the universal nature of individualism. In other words, who had respect for the individual as an individual? There, I think it's certainly true that Christians and the Greeks had a different viewpoint. I understand what Leonard Peikoff is saying, James, but I'm very curious, and there's more to the answer, but I'm very curious to hear your thoughts on this subject, because I think we've heard this multiple times that, well, you've got to give the Christians their due. They at least had the idea of individual salvation, and isn't that something that the Greeks didn't have? What do you think?
Well, I think I understand where Ayn Rand is coming from, and I think I know where her influences on this come from as well. She was deeply influenced, as you know, and a friend of Isabel Patterson's. And for those of us objectivists who greatly admire her work, God of the Machine, I would put a little asterisk, perhaps a big asterisk, next to that, because she was a believer in God, and she did believe in the positive impact of religion. And it is true that the individual soul, that individualism in the last 300 years, modern liberalism, emerged from Christian society. There's no doubt about it. And from a bunch of philosophers who were trying, in my mind, to integrate Greek ideas with Christian philosophy, starting with Thomas Aquinas, all the way up to John Locke and the founding fathers. Now, the point that Peikoff makes there is a brilliant one. The Greeks had both collectivism and individualism philosophically, and this begins at the metaphysical level. Plato believed that there were no individual, that what you saw, individual horses, individual bananas, individual people. That's not the reality. The reality is in some unperceived supernatural dimension, this world of forms where there's one perfect horse and one perfect banana and one perfect, and even those exist only in relation to higher forms. More than that, in his politics, Plato was a collectivist. This whole body analogy, this we're part of the body, the Corpus Christi, that comes from Plato. That comes from Plato. You know, some of us are the philosopher kings, the brains of the body. And if you happen to be the little toe or the toenail, then so much the worse for you, you get clipped off. So that kind of organic collectivism that Christianity has built into it, it got straight from the metaphysics of Plato, which it incorporates pretty straightforwardly. St. Augustine, the most important Christian philosopher of the early centuries of Christianity, was very much a Platonist in this regard. Aristotle, in contrast, believed that reality was the particular, the individual. There is no horseness apart from that horse, or manness apart from that man and that man. So metaphysically, Aristotle is the father of individualism in Greek thought in that sense. Aristotle deserves the credit for giving the metaphysical reality and supremacy to the individual. And in subsequent Hellenistic philosophy, they didn't remain true, I think, to Aristotle, but still the Stoics and the Epicureans, those people focused on the individual psychology, how to be happy in a terrible world, how to find peace of mind within some kind of happiness. They had a wrong conception of happiness, avoiding suffering, but at least it's the individual and the individual's happiness and well-being that Greek philosophy was focused on. Cut frame to Christianity. Christianity is inheriting, it's true, it's about the salvation of the immortal soul. And so there's parts of the New Testament where you'll hear something like from St. Paul, in Christ there is no slave, no free man, there's no male, female, there's no Greek, there's no Jew. That sounds like radical egalitarianism on the face of it. He's talking about in another dimension. He's talking about there. He's not actually saying treat women better. He's not actually saying get rid of slavery. He's not actually saying that social distinctions don't exist. In fact, Jesus actually has a hierarchy in heaven. The first shall be last and the last shall be first. So if you are martyred here on earth and had a miserable life on earth, you may be the very top. So there's a heavenly hierarchy. Most definitely the saints and the martyrs are way up there, and the rest of us sort of have to earn our way into heaven through purgatory. There's a rank in heaven. So the point that there's some kind of radical egalitarianism in heaven is a mistaken idea. That was not the original conception either. However, as Greek ideas later got introduced into Christian thought, again, starting with Thomas Aquinas, the idea of the individual began to become much, much more important. All in the religions, the Greek religions that came before Christianity, people aren't very familiar with this. They're known as the mystery religions. And centuries before Christianity, the individual soul was what these religions were all about. If you gain some secret knowledge, have some secret belief, get some secret or behave virtuously in a different way, it will matter to your immortal soul. So that kind of individualism, that kind of radical egalitarianism existed already in all of these mystery cults that existed before Christianity, were Greek in origin and based on Greek ideas that Christianity basically took over. So whatever individualistic aspects there are to Christianity, I would credit to Greek culture. Now, it's true, insofar as Christianity was a transmission belt, and later, especially after Aquinas became a transmission belt for Greek ideas, it fostered individualism. And as I said at the very beginning, it is Christians like John Locke who really brought this to a climax, the importance of the individual here on earth. And that's the distinction I would draw. So I don't credit Christianity much, to be honest, with it. I think it's what Christianity inherited. I think there were religions before Christianity that did that got the idea from the Greeks. And when it really comes down to it, it's metaphysics. And Aristotle is the father of individualism in that sense.
Yeah, tell me if this sounds about right to you, because my understanding would be that if there was no explicit identification of individualism in the Greeks, part of it is because the Greeks were not homogeneous. You had the Socratics, you had this kind of unique blend of rationalism and pragmatism in the rhetoric, and Plato then formalizes philosophy for us, but with this faulty conceptual idea. And Aristotle finally puts it all together and says, you're right about philosophy, you're wrong about all of your answers. So when we talk about Greek culture being imperfect, well, if we talk about Aristotle, if we talk about the culmination of Greek culture from the arts going back to Homer and then up through early philosophy and finally Aristotle, in that sense, I don't think there's much missing. And the individualism that we give Catholicism or Christianity more broadly credit for, it's only because individualism was being understood over the course of time. It was becoming obvious that it is the individual who thinks. And who gets credit for it? Well, the people who were essentially running philosophy at the time. The Catholics discovered it because it was there to be discovered at that time. And that's why I don't give them too much credit for it either.
Well, for the vast majority of Christian history, Christians had slaves. Christians had kings, special kings, hereditary kings, anointed kings. They had theocracies. Within the Catholic Church, there was a strict hierarchy. The Pope, who has a special relationship to God, the cardinals that work for him, the bishops that you have to obey, the priests who could have your gateway to heaven or not. So the idea that this sort of individualism led to a kind of a radical egalitarianism, at least of rights among people and individuals, is just a false conception. It took them until the Enlightenment. Isn't that funny? The vast majority, 1700 years of Christian history had to pass by before Christians ever discovered serious arguments for individuals and individual rights. So I think that's an Enlightenment achievement. Yes. Through most of the Dark Ages, strict hierarchy in actual society existed, just as they conceived of a heavenly hierarchy in heaven.
Yes. Given everything, well, what do you think of this comparison? And tell me if you think I'm way off base here, but in a certain context, certain ideas are going to be discovered. You give them enough time and eventually individualism will be undeniable, just like there are certain ideas, certain scientific ideas, just discoveries, technological discoveries that were discovered by Soviet scientists and by Nazi scientists. They're rare. Their record is terrible.
They promoted a good deal of pseudoscience too, that they thought was consistent with communism and Nazism, but also
But just to take those few actual accomplishments, they were there to be discovered, and it's no credit to them above and beyond just those few individuals who were smart enough to find them. And I feel the same way about individualism. It was there to be discovered. It was going to be figured out. And if we hadn't had a dark and Middle Ages, I think it would have taken less than 1400 years to figure it out after the accomplishments of the Greeks. So another reason why, I can't give Christianity much credit for that.
Isn't it funny how John Locke, the most Aristotelian of the greatest of the Enlightenment philosophers, was the one who also came up with the idea of individual rights, cogent intellectual arguments against slavery, etc.
Yes. Yeah. And Leonard Peikoff has made that point. It was only when Christianity became less important that Christianity could also acknowledge individualism. He wraps up his answer by saying, so there are two issues, in other words, the value and the understanding of its application. He says, I think another example of that is the Founding Fathers and the issues of freedom. The Founding Fathers certainly stood for freedom and were its embodiment. And yet they advocated slavery, or they tolerated slavery. Again, the issue was, well, what is a man? Now, they had to discover that color is not a relevant factor and then apply it fully. I think it is an exact parallel with the individualism of the Greeks. Yeah, so the Greeks had that respect for logic and for life on earth, at least a far greater extent than anybody else had. And it was just a matter of time before the application of what Aristotle gave us was going to lead to that individualism. That's whether you want to
Absolutely.
give the Christians credit for that or not, because they inherited the ideas that made that possible.
Absolutely, absolutely. The founding fathers inherited slavery from their Christian forebears. There's no question about it. Now, there were many, and some of the greatest of the founding fathers were philosophically opposed to slavery, even if they did still have lingering racist ideas. Men like Thomas Jefferson, Benjamin Franklin, John Adams were all, from the beginning, fierce opponents of the very concept of slavery. And the language that, frankly, that they put into America's founding arguments was the ticking time bomb that would destroy slavery in the next century. Again, I'm going to credit in fact, Aristotle, who Ayn Rand called the first of America's founding fathers. And in this sense, the metaphysical sense, it's true. He is the father of metaphysical individualism and the logic, right? And notice his ethics too was focused on individual happiness here on earth. So when our founding fathers said in the Declaration, each individual has the equal right to pursue his or her own happiness here on earth, it was a profoundly Aristotelian thing. And it was opposed by conservative Christians at the time.
Yes. Now, we are talking about how to change the world, and we're considering it part of the analysis through the long scope of history. And since we've mentioned the founding fathers, I want to go to the second question. If you were able to pick a time, Leonard Peikoff was asked, when it would be best to influence a culture, which era would you pick? And Leonard Peikoff, unsurprisingly, says, well, my first reaction would have been, of course, pagan Greece, because it was before Christianity, from which the West never recovered, and therefore it was a really pro-reason civilization. But if you're taking the full situation at that time, and not merely the philosophic essence of the culture, well, Athens was extremely weak militarily in relation to Sparta and the rest of the world, and whatever their victories, they were militarily doomed, one way or the other, basically by savages, by less educated people, by the Macedonians, for example. Thus, even if you had influenced them, there wasn't the technology to keep the civilization alive long enough. So it wouldn't have done you much good. I'll stop the quote there for a moment because that's interesting. I'd never really thought of it that way, that the decline of Athens was, well, it was essentially historical. It was essentially, well, at the time, there were stronger, if not greater, civilizations out there. That's interesting.
Absolutely. In that pre-Socratic period, there was comparative political freedom because of the independence of the various city-states of Greece and their separation from the great old kingdoms of Egypt and so forth of the Middle East. This gave them freedom for these merchants and seafaring people who were in competition with one another to come up with new ideas, to be bold in their thinking. But that independence of Greece, especially in Athens, my goodness, there was a revolution in thought. But poor Athens was sort of doomed from the outset by the political forces, the military forces around them. And even though they had a tremendous influence on the Macedonians, and the Macedonians carried those ideas through Alexander the Great and his conquests to the rest of the Near and Middle East, even though that's also true, the poor Athens, and boy, he makes a point too about wouldn't it have been nice to I think of Aristotle's main mistakes. For example, if consciousness possessed an identity, that would be a distorting factor in epistemology. That was a big mistake. No, so if you imagine an Ayn Rand coming in there, of course you can't even imagine it, coming in and saying, no, 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 no. The fact that we have eyes doesn't mean that we're blind. That's our means of perception. It needs a causal mechanism, Aristotle. Consciousness has an identity. It must, like everything else. Boy, he could have cut off at the pass all of these later, all these modern philosophy problems from Descartes to Hume to Kant. If you'd done that, boy, we could have fixed it. But in that context, even that would have had a limited effect because poor Athens never had a chance to develop its rational philosophy because of those other forces, historical forces surrounding it. So I can only agree with Dr. Peikoff there very, very strongly.
It's funny, it came up recently again, both in the context of some HBL discussions and more broadly on the socials. The question returns of street smarts versus book smarts. We think, well, in ancient Greece, the street smarts won, the tough guys won over the nerds. But of course, it's such a bad description, because when it comes to book smarts, well, we had the great minds, and you can include Socrates and Plato in that, but especially Aristotle, who brought it all together. And also included in the book smarts are the Catholics, the witch doctors. So really, Ayn Rand's description of the Attilas and the witch doctors versus the men of reasons. It's not street smarts and book smarts. It's Attila and the witch doctors, the back and forth between military conquest and the conquest of the church and other forms of historical witch doctors, versus the men of the mind, the men of reason. And the great thing about modern times is, at least right now, the greatest military strength is also in the country with the greatest freedom. So, speaking of the country of the greatest freedom, born in the era of the Enlightenment, Leonard Peikoff goes on to say, I think maybe therefore the best choice would be the Enlightenment in the 18th century. Well, then they had a chance, as the American Revolution showed, to defend themselves against the world. And they had a lot of good ideas. But the trouble is, they were so deeply penetrated by the Christian ethics that even though they withdrew any emphasis from the Christian metaphysics and epistemology, well, nothing else penetrated but the Christian ethics. Would they have been open, if Ayn Rand had been alive, to her ethics? And Leonard Peikoff says, I don't know. And that's a great question. If the founding fathers had had access to objectivism, would it have been too soon? Do you have any thoughts on that? Oh, wait a minute, I'm sorry. I want to know if you have any thoughts on that, but I have got to give a huge shout out to long-term ARCUK supporter and all-around good guy, Jeff Bannister, who is in with our first super chat of the day, and a super chat that is above and beyond $400. That is a majestic and magnanimous super chat for the end of the year. Jeff, thank you so much for that. You have been a great supporter of the ARCUK, and this is a beautiful one to keep what we do going. And so I have to read Jeff's comment. Oh, this is good. He says, yes, Yaron is on now, but I prefer to be here with the two objectivist teachers I value most. I am looking forward to the continuation of OPAR in the new year, I hope. Here is my year-end contribution for ARCUK. Thanks for what you taught me this year. Happy New Year to you, James and Robert. Thank you. And everybody else behind the scenes. And Jeff, that is magnificent. And what you do does support everybody behind the scenes. Again, all super chats support the Ayn Rand Center UK. Jeff, that is magnificent. Thank you for that.
Thank you, Jeff. My goodness. I'm rendered speechless, and that's rare. Thank you, sir. There are no words to express my gratitude. That is breathtaking. Thank you.
We talk about value for value, and that's certainly what that is. But some trades are more majestic than others, and this is really talk about
my goodness.
Talk about putting your money where your mind is.
Where your mind is. That's exactly it. Wow. I've now completely forgotten the question that you asked, Robert. I'm so taken aback by his super chat.
In the era of the Enlightenment, what do you think if somebody had managed to put a copy of the Objectivist Ethics or Atlas Shrugged in the hands of people like Benjamin Franklin and Thomas Jefferson and James Madison and the great thinkers, the great political thinkers?
They had boldness. They had boldness. Look at the Enlightenment liberated the mind in so many amazing ways. Think of David Hume making arguments like he was making against religion. Think of Voltaire in France making the arguments against religion that he was making at this time. There were bold people during the Enlightenment who were making all kinds of hardcore criticisms. Look at the founding fathers. I know I mentioned it the other day. Thomas Paine, the great salesman of the American Revolution, wrote a book called The Age of Reason, systematic attack on Orthodox Christianity. Or Thomas Jefferson, who wrote, New Greek, it is his own Greek translation of the New Testament, cut out all the miracles, but left in the moral teachings of Jesus That's what Peikoff was getting at. The moral, they were ready to question religion. But the greatest mind, as I said at this time, John Locke, he was a faithful, good Christian.
Yes.
That had a big impact. Now, they were ready to question religion, but were they ready to question altruism, which is what they really needed to question? And most of these people just assumed the morality of altruism, whether it's, the given emotions that are the basis of values, as Hume was sort of saying, well, whatever you feel is the basis of emotion. They're not, Kant in particular, he went out of his way to systematically defend duty ethics, to systematically attack reason, and to defend the Christian worldview against these Enlightenment onslaughts. I'm not sure that the Christian civilization at that time, even the deist civilization at that time, was ready to question altruism, although that would have been the moment, if you could have done it, because they were questioning everything with, as Thomas Jefferson said to his nephew, question everything with boldness, even the existence of God, right? They were questioning things like that, and that was the most fertile moment, if, and it's a big I don't know for me, if they could have been willing to challenge what I think is even more profound, the ethics of altruism, which is sort of psychologically seeped into them in an emotional way. And is still, that emotional resistance, I think, is still our main competitor, but can only be met with ideas, better ideas.
Yes. Yeah, I suppose maybe it was too soon for Madison to read Outlandish, but I would love to have seen some of the European philosophers receive that, and then as the Americans would go over, bring it back. If we could have gotten a copy of Opar in the hands of Baruch Spinoza or Voltaire, and then let Benjamin Franklin go over to France and have.
Had they yet seen the role of reason in human survival, they really have had to have had like Ayn Rand said, she herself sort of needed the experience of the Industrial Revolution. In the 1700s, that was just getting underway. It was underway, but it was just getting underway. So could people really see part of the bone structure of Ayn Rand's argument yet from history? I think it's there with enough evidence, but could they have really seen it with the clarity that we can now see it in the 20th and 21st centuries?
Yes. So obviously you agree with Leonard Peikoff when he says he doesn't know, but possibly Christianity has got a ways to go yet, and nothing can dislodge it until there's some final disaster which causes a total break with it. He says, well, don't ask me about when that would happen, but he thinks the Enlightenment, therefore, was the best shot, but that's by no means definite.
Right.
And obviously it's all just a thought experiment to say, man, what would have happened?
Well, people have free will, and there's no way of knowing how they would have reacted. Some great minds might have picked up on that if it had been there, and that could have at least planted the seeds for a whole new movement in the next 200 years to come. That's speculation.
Well, but that also teases the final question. But before we get to that, real quick, question number 3, what, if anything, and this is a recurring question, so this is an important one and very practical, what, if anything, would prevent a proper government, if we ever establish one, from sliding towards socialism, as the United States has done? It's a perennial question when you talk to especially libertarians and anarchists who say, well, so long as there's a government, it's always going to slide back towards socialism and collectivism and power. So it's an interesting question. And Leonard Peikoff starts off his answer by saying, I think it was Benjamin Franklin who said, eternal vigilance is the price of liberty. But it must be vigilant, unquote, Benjamin Franklin. Leonard Peikoff goes on, but it must be vigilance not in regard to spotting dictators, but more basically in regard to spotting philosophers who are going to destroy the foundations of society and then refuting them. That was a profound weakness in the founding of the United States. Great politics, but no real philosophic foundations. The founding fathers were not philosophers, and therefore, when the wave of Kantian statism swept the world, their descendants had no answer. Above all, the founders had no answer to religion. It's true that they were much better than the Christians, but they had deism, and deism was a very bad viewpoint. Deism was the view that God, the omnipotent creator, created the world and its laws, but then he retired. And we're free now to study the world without reference to faith or God. This was obviously better than Christianity. The Greek view, though, was that God did not create the world. The world was eternal. And there was no single God. There was a bunch of lesser gods who weren't worth very much. Those gods did not create the laws. The laws were inherent in the nature of things. It's funny, that expression. Those gods weren't worth very much. And if you read the plays at the time, obviously they were petty and mischievous and foolish, kind of like the God of the Bible, actually.
Yes.
I mean, jealous and envious and
happy to wipe out the human population.
Yeah.
The cause of human wars and stuff. Absolutely. And that's not unique to the Greeks. But I'll tell you what's unique to the Greeks versus the Christians is their view of the afterlife, the view of life on earth. I mean, in Homer, Achilles in the Iliad is the great hero who chooses a short and glorious life over a long and boring life that no one will remember. But when Odysseus in the Odyssey gets to the underworld, he meets the ghost of Achilles, and Achilles says, "Oh, my friend, it's much better to be a slave on earth than to be lord here in the underworld." And Odysseus he sees the ghost of his mother, and he can't embrace the ghost of his mother. See, for the Greeks, the afterlife was this shadowy, inferior existence. Life on earth is what counted. The Christians, of course, reverses that altogether. It's true, those differences, polytheism versus monotheism. Monotheism, when it takes power, tends to be more intolerant. Our God and only our God. Whereas polytheist societies can say, well, maybe your gods can match up with our gods and we've just got different names for them, that kind of thing. The monotheism generally comes with intolerance, and a focus on the supernatural must diminish our appreciation for this world all around, including individuals and the possibility for freedom. So here the Greeks are infinitely superior across the board in many ways from Christianity. And I will just cite once more the fact that it was the reintroduction of Greek ideas and only the climax of that in Christian society during the Enlightenment that brought human beings something like the American Revolution. But yeah, it's ethics. The founding fathers lacked a coherent ethical code. And more than that, even people like Locke did not have the epistemological answers to the mystics and the skeptics.
Yes. So eternal vigilance, indeed. Leonard Peikoff wraps up that answer by saying, you cannot now say that, well, if we establish objectivism as the ruling philosophy in 100 years, 500 years from now, well, it's still going to be there. So men have free will, as you say, James. He goes on, you could even project Galt's Gulch in Atlas Shrugged, the perfect ideal, degenerating in a few generations. There is some catastrophe or an invasion by some enemy. People scatter. There's a panic among some of the weaker people. Some of the leaders get killed. Who knows? You can't rule it out. All you can say is a rational philosophy is the best chance of it persisting. But yes, eternal vigilance is absolutely the order
of vigilance of ideas and vigilance in fundamental ideas. It is issues of philosophy, metaphysics, epistemology, ethics that are going to condition our answers in politics. If we don't keep straight about that, no political system, no concept. I've said it 100 times, I'll say it 1,000 more. No constitution, however perfectly written, even if we cut out all the errors and contradictions to the original American Constitution, and there were errors and contradictions, but even if we got rid of all of those, it would be, and we had the perfect constitution written by, let's imagine, a John Galt himself or something, or a Judge Narragansett from Ragnar Daneskjöld from Atlas Shrugged. Let's say they got together, wrote the perfect constitution. It would be no automatic guarantee of human freedom. We have to understand it. We have to appreciate it. We have to understand why humans need rights, why rights are essential to human happiness and human progress and prosperity, and why dictatorship and slavery is wrong. Otherwise, there's really no guarantee that we won't slip back into another tyranny or worse, another dark ages. Mysticism and collectivism and altruism are always looming out there. And who knows what bad ideas in the future may be looming out there. It's eternal vigilance, but not necessarily in a military sense, and not certainly in America today in a military sense, but in an ideological sense, eternal vigilance. Amen, Dr. P.
Yes. And a little more controversy, because there's one more question, but this is going to raise, well, I'm really interested to hear what you think of the question and what you think of Dr. Peikoff's answer. Leonard Peikoff was asked in 2011, in past decades, you seemed to believe that getting objectivist philosophy into colleges was the top priority. But in the dim hypothesis, you seem to be suggesting that the most important thing is to develop a wide variety of objectivist products in other cultural areas, such as literature, physics, and education. Is this a dramatic shift in your thinking? Now, there was unquote the question, there was a recent discussion on HBO. There was a Meeting of the Minds episode, the Sunday shows that Harry Binswanger does. If you're not already subscribed to the Harry Binswanger letter, the forum that he conducts, you need to be subscribed to that, because he does these Sunday meetings of the minds right after your Sunday sessions, James. And one of the recent ones was, how do you answer the seeming conflict between philosophy as the driver of history, but free will is the driver of an individual's life and success? And that was an interesting discussion. So Leonard Peikoff is asked, well, you seem to believe that getting objectivist in philosophy into the colleges is most important, but in DIM, you seem to think that, no, what we need is in all of those different areas, those aspects of life that are discussed in the DIM hypothesis, that's where we need to have an impact in each of those areas. So he's asked, is this a dramatic shift in your thinking? Because of that HBL episode, I've been thinking about this too.
Good.
And Leonard Peikoff answered at the time, no, not in context, but in emphasis. Then he says, I still believe, of course, that philosophy is the base of all these other aspects of culture, that it is the priority. It's what makes the rest of them possible. What's important to me is what affects the cultural philosophy, what the effects of cultural philosophy are in promoting a new kind of society, in making the philosophy actually effective in the world. That's where I think art, science, and education come in. These are the areas that directly change a country, because people are not changed by reading the Critique of Pure Reason by Kant, or even by reading Atlas Shrugged. Ordinary people may like one and hate the other, but that does not affect the way they live. What affects them is the kind of art, movies, literature, books, what the scientists say, what the teachers around them say, all of which reflects philosophy, but is not directly philosophy. And then he says, I see two stages in taking over a culture intellectually. First, the philosophy must be entrenched in the academic world. Then it must express itself in these cultural manifestations. Only when that combination has taken place will you be able to have a free society. Now, if you ask me which is most important to get established in a society, obviously, in one sense, philosophy is, because that is the primary, the fundamental. But in another sense, it's like asking what's more important, the cause or the effect. You can't ignore the effect, because the cause by itself will not produce the end that you want. In that sense, it's not true that philosophy is more important than other fields. It is so only as the ultimate cause, and therefore as the first concern. Practically, it means I advise you not to sneer at areas other than philosophy. This is this paragraph where he's summing this up. Practically, it means I advise you not to sneer at areas other than philosophy, not to think that a novelist or a physicist or a grade school teacher are nowhere in the battle for the world. They are essential. And I think my book shows you the extent to which philosophy has no power without that kind of activity. Well, James, I don't think that answer changes anything that Leonard Peikoff has said over the years, but I do think that the dim hypothesis sort of brings the rest of us in as players, as fighters in this battle, in a way
Right.
that maybe the previous works didn't make clear or as obvious. Do you think?
Right. Yeah, we're not determinists. We're not philosophical determinists. Just because a good idea or a better idea is out there in philosophy doesn't automatically guarantee social change. No, indeed. Some of the most effective ways in which Christianity stays alive today, in this, imagine how the heck does religion persist in the 21st century? How does religion persist in the 21st century? Haven't philosophers shown that there's no logical basis for God? They sure have. And it's not those logical arguments for or against that keep religion alive. What keeps religion alive are, well, what about ethics? Well, where does that come from? More than that, I've got this social network of wonderful, these virtuous people that I know that are Christians. And look at all this beauty. And then the kicker is all this religious art. Oh my God, that really drives it home emotionally and gives it vivid reality to people. If a philosophy remains just an academic series of words, it will have zero impact on the wider culture. We need, I'll use the transmission belt analogy again. We need the transmission belt between the abstract ideas, especially ideas so abstract as philosophy, and their concrete manifestations. And they have to be seen in culture, in art, in politics, in science, everything that we do, your school teacher to your bus driver even. I'm going to include the bus driver in this. I'm going to include your plumber and your doctor in this. If Christians 500 years ago made beautiful art, those cathedrals and that stained glass, look at Michelangelo. His statues, more frequently than not, had religious subject matters. David, the Pietà, Moses, he worked on the Vatican. When you have the greatest artist in the world bringing to life your philosophy, boy, does that sell your philosophy. And it's having artists like Michelangelo that did a whole lot to keep Christianity going. It's that transmission belt, that ability to see the connection between all this beautiful, magnificent, inspiring art, etc., and the ideas that bring the ideas to life and give an emotional reality to the individual. Notice Ayn Rand did not choose to be an academic philosopher, even though she had unique philosophical ideas from the time, I believe, from the time she's in her teens and 20s. She became an artist, a novelist, and she in effect bypassed academia by getting straight through with a work of art. By means of art, you can show the concrete reality of something, the emotional reality of something, how it works and how you live it in reality, which is at least as important, right, as the abstract ideas. Now, the abstract ideas are the most important in one sense. They are the sine qua non, without which nothing. Until we have an established philosophy that, and when he says entrenched, we don't need it to be the majority idea in academia. We just need to have serious academics out there with a voice, and we're starting to. Professor Tara Smith or Robert Mayhew or Greg Salmieri, people like that who are making inroads in academia are the necessary precondition for any of this really taking hold in society. But another important and necessary condition, even if it's a causally second condition, it's still, in this sense, a causally primary condition until people can see in works of art and in individuals. I mean, think of it, in the Middle Ages, they had heroes like St. Francis of Assisi, kind to children, good to animals, and he embodied this Christian. Their heroes were Christian. They're real life heroes. Their art was Christian, the art that emotionally inspired them, the music, the visuals, all of that. And all of that kept alive an emotional reality to this philosophy, made it part of their psychology, their whole way of life and existing. Until we can do that, objectivism will not change the world. I have to agree with Ayn Rand. It's not just philosophers, it's artists who will lead us into a new renaissance. artists who will lead us into a new renaissance. They are part of that necessary transmission belt to give concrete reality to these abstract ideas, to show to people what it really means vividly and in practice. So write stories, write novels, paint paintings, be good at what you do. It's an astonishing thing. Simply being a good lawyer, will be, how are you a good lawyer, Mr. Valliant? How did you manage to do that and that? It didn't on the face of it look like objectivism at all. It was just someone seeing me do a good job. Right? And if they were really curious and they asked, well, what is your basis for, what are your moral principles, Mr. Valliant? I've got an answer for them, but they could see it in vivid reality. So whether you're a plumber or an electrician, believe it or not, even at that level, doing your job well, knowing why you're doing it, is far more effective in changing culture, frankly.
Yes.
No, there is a hierarchy of importance here, obviously, and it starts with abstract philosophy. It is the precondition, the necessary, but not necessarily sufficient condition. And that's what I would say here. The necessary and sufficient condition for abstract ideas to change a culture is to have all these intermediate transmission belts, art, science, all the way down to individual heroes or villains. People who do their job well or don't do their job well, people who are courageous and have integrity in their individual lives, or people who are just pusillanimous social metaphysician cowards. And really, it's what we as objectivists do in our lives that can help change the culture if they are consistent expressions of objectivism. But of course, we're doing it because of our own happiness. That's what objectivism is telling us our ultimate why is. But one of the byproducts of that, one of the side effects of being a good objectivist, good at what you do, being happy in your life, is that you're working to change the culture. To change the culture, start with you. Do your job well. Know what you're doing. Think through your ideas. And believe me, one of the byproduct and what you might consider an accidental manifestation of that is to start changing the entire world around you. If you want to change the world, it does begin with ideas, but it begins with ideas that you're implementing in your life, doing what you want to do, your selfish joy. And if your selfish joy is to paint paintings and to be a poet, love poetry. You think love poetry that may have no direct relation to objectivism. You just do it well. And it's, say, romantic art that inspires people. That's going to have more impact on changing the culture in the long run, than just about anything you can do. Not all of us can be philosophers. And yes, we assume a good philosophy, and we depend upon having a good philosophy. But the way we change the world is by enacting it, living it, being good at what we do, knowing what we're doing. If you want to change the world, start with yourself.
Absolutely. Now I have a little more I want to say on that, but I've got to read a super chat from Daniel. Thank you very much for your contribution. He says, Happy New Year, gentlemen. Thank you, James, for your work on creating Christ. The documentary was very enlightening. He says, I will be reading the book soon. And he says, I just read The Role of Religion in History. So James, of course, thank you for that work. And I love that you have your books behind you, because anybody who hasn't yet bought and read those books, Passion of Ayn Rand's Critics is getting hard to track down a copy, but if you're creative, they are out there. And Creating Christ, of course, the documentary is now available. If you haven't read the book yet, you can get an idea what is in the book, and it's available on all of the services now. Highly recommended. So thank you for your super chat, Daniel. Now, and James, you may have something to say about that, but I also have something more I want to say on this topic.
Go.
Okay.
I'm curious as to what you're going to say.
One of the great things about being part of the Ayn Rand Center UK is that we have people who are extremely strong in objectivism, people like yourself, well-studied, and you are presenting study groups that make it possible for a lot of folks who have less information than you do to come up to speed quickly. But we've also got folks who are involved primarily in psychology or in education or in entertainment, exactly the kinds of folks to whom this question refers. People who are objectivists, but aren't necessarily expressing objectivism. It's simply, this is what objectivism looks like in the real world. It's one of the reasons why I appreciate the super chats we're getting today to support the Ayn Rand Center UK. There was a time when we had to be a little more concerned about people speaking out as objectivists because they could be taken as speaking for objectivism, which on the ARS UK we say repeatedly, no. Primary sources, that's objectivism. Ayn Rand is objectivism. Things Leonard Peikoff did while Ayn Rand was alive, including the early drafts of OPAR, the Objectivism, the Philosophy of Ayn Rand, that's objectivism. We're just objectivists and sharing our best ideas and understanding and our enthusiasm and in some cases our entertainment. And so when that question came up on the HBL, Harry Binswanger's Meeting of the Minds, I thought, well, there's no contradiction between philosophy as the driver of history and free will as the driver of an individual's life, if you understand what philosophy means. And sure, philosophy is 5 branches and answers on metaphysics and epistemology and ethics and politics and aesthetics, but what philosophy is the owner's manual of your life. Philosophy is precisely that love of wisdom, and wisdom isn't floating, or at least shouldn't be. It's certainly not an objectivism. No, these are the ideas by which we live. There's no contradiction if you properly understand that the one identification of philosophy is a mover of history and free will is the mover of life. It identifies the same fact. You know, the dominant philosophy of a culture guides and explains history, but what is dominant philosophy? You know, it's the set of ideas that the greatest number of people, and in particular the most influential individuals, have accepted, the ideas that they've chosen, whether explicitly or by default. And the ideas that people choose to guide their actions, that's what philosophy is. So the system of ideas that guides a man's choices and actions, philosophy is chosen by any given individual. And the dominant system of ideas in a given culture that guide men's choices and actions determine the course of history. Properly understood, you're saying the same thing twice, even though it's a different perspective in both directions. Does that sound about right to you?
An objectivist world will still have irrational people in it. People have free will. People will evade and be dishonest. Alas, people have free will. If objectivism comes to be culturally dominant, though, they will be the outcasts. They will have the uphill battle. They will have the hard time. Will they still have the free will to reject reason and reality? You bet. Will they still have the free will even to act as their own destroyers and not accept a pro-life code of values? Absolutely. The question is, could they have a cultural influence in an objectivist world? Well, they'd have to overcome the influence of objectivism with a more powerful system of ideas, at least a more influential one. And I say, good luck for this. Good luck to that. If you can beat objectivism, go for it. I don't see it happening, but that's the level on which they would have to see. It's at a culture-wide level that philosophy has its cultural impact. On an individual level, we all still have free will. We all still have free will. Philosophy has the power of getting through to large numbers at a time and therefore shaping a culture. That's the distinction I would draw here. People are not going to, not have free will anymore, but by the same token, philosophy is still going to be the powerful engine that motivates their psychology and indeed all of history. Both can be true. Both are true.
Yes.
But it is by means of ideas that we change history. But it isn't necessarily by means of being a philosopher. Right. We have, Ayn Rand and Leonard Peikoff have, in effect, given us this philosophy, and certainly more than enough philosophy to change the world. It's now up to us to implement that philosophy in reality, show how it is consistent with scientific progress, with artistic beauty, with individual freedom, and with personal happiness.
Yes.
And insofar as each and every one of us can embody and enact that, we're embodying and enacting the philosophy that will change the world. But yeah, nothing forces people to accept a philosophy. My book, Creating Christ, it isn't objectivism at all. You could reject everything in my book and still be a good objectivist in my mind. It is a theory about the origins of Christianity and where it came from. I think it deploys the objectivist epistemology. It's thinking about induction, it's understanding of ideas in history, and where Christianity gets these Greek ideas as well as these more mystical ideas from, and how it vindicates, in my mind, Ayn Rand's view of the power motives behind altruists who are out there collecting the sacrifices, about the witch doctors. I think it's perfectly consistent, and in fact gives expression to Ayn Rand's belief in that. But we're not, capital O, claiming to be the spokespeople for Objectivism. We are not. I am no Ayn Rand. I am no Leonard Peikoff. I could never have come up with the ideas that they came up with. But notice what I'm trying to do. I'm trying to implement those ideas as I understand them in my own intellectual work. And so in effect, being as a historian, I'm just one of these transmission belts, teaching people how, I hope, how to think about history and how to think about ideas and their influence on history. That's all I'm doing. And that's what we call, we can't stand out there and say, hey, I am the embodiment, I'm the new John Galt, I'm the embodiment of objectivism. No, we're each individuals, and we're each expressing, even those of us who sincerely believe it insofar as we understand it, we're each simply enacting it and expressing it in the various ways we have, whether we're artists, scientists, historians, or, as I say, even just plumbers.
Yes. I have to read a super chat real quick because for those who do not choose their philosophy explicitly, of course, the world provides a substitute for that. Jeff Bannister, great supporter, ARCUK, quotes Rush, the great Neil Peart, who went out on a high note with the album Clockwork Angels. And a quote from the album: "You promise every treasure to the foolish and the wise, goddesses of mystery, spirits in disguise. Every pleasure we bow and close our eyes, clockwork angels promise every prize." I have to put that out there too for Jennifer, who I know is a Yarenbrook super fan, so she will catch this show later and might not see the chat, but she will appreciate Rush being quoted because she's also a Rush super fan as well. Thank you for that, Jeff.
I've been a Rush fan since I was a teenager.
Outstanding. I really came into Rush too late. Big fan during the Permanent Ways Moving Pictures period, but I should have been seeing them live. I did not realize how extraordinary they were. I've got a huge shout out to Objectivist Steve Henderson.
Okay, I'm gonna
do a Rush concert.
Year's envy. I was there, front row, Madison Square Garden, in 1983 to see Rush. The tickets were comped by Neil Peart himself. So I have to say I was very privileged. I've seen Rush multiple times in concert, and it is something to see.
That is privilege. Unfair.
I knew I'd get you green with envy.
I just count myself lucky having seen them before they stopped. So better late than never. And yeah, again, that Clockwork Angels tour, which is available on Blu-ray, on DVD now. Yeah. I've never seen a better use of just about every aspect of what you can do in a live show. The use of screens, we think, oh yeah, big screens and background screens and concerts and television screens up in the air. No, it's just jaw-dropping, and add that to the magnificent performance, the incredible music.
Virtuosos.
Unbelievable. Now, we're coming up at the top of the hour. We are wrapping up Peikoff Wednesdays for the year on this important topic of objectivism and saving the world. And James, I think you've said it as well as it can be said, that the ideas are there. We've been given those resources by Ayn Rand and Leonard Peikoff, and it's now up to us to go out and make it happen. And I don't think there's any better way to spread these ideas than living a rational life, your own best life. And that's why I intend to talk about integrity tomorrow, both on TDO, on the Daily Objective, because we're doing Thursday Collective, Book of the Month, and we're going to do a Book of the Year feature, and I have an important book on integrity to talk about. But also for my show, Life on Earth, that's going to be good.
Folks, don't miss it. Life on Earth is maybe the best the best individual podcast being done on the internet today. I don't miss them, and I always find great value in them, sir. I want to thank you. Since we are at the end of the year, I want to thank you for your amazing work. You were there for me in a way you probably don't even know, emotionally, psychologically, as well as intellectually, Mr. Nasir. Not only are you and your wife two of the most wonderful, benevolent human beings I've ever met, but you have been a great intellectual and emotional support to me through what has been at times a difficult year. So thank you, sir, very much. Thank you for being a hero for me, and thank you for all of the wisdom and benevolence you express every week. Please don't miss Life on Earth. You will not regret it. It is a selfish treat, believe me.
That is very, very good of you to say. And it makes the point that whatever you think of the way Robert Nasir is living his life, living your own best life. Amy often says when we talk about politics, you can't improve politics. You can't make things better by being a jerk. And there's a similar thing. You can't change people's philosophies if you go out there and say, yeah, I'm miserable because the world sucks, but you should adopt the philosophy I live by. What are you? You're miserable. And I get it. We all face hard times. I'm not criticizing anybody for being unhappy in life, but if you want to sell these ideas, the best way to do that is to live them, and to live the kind of life where people say, maybe I don't want to do what that guy does for a living. Maybe I don't like his style. Maybe I don't want this, but I want his spirit. I want his panache. I want his vaudeville. I want his lust for life that apparently is supported by these ideas he believes. So I will be talking about integrity tomorrow. We've got some other interesting shows come up real quick. The TDO for today, the Daily Objective, Steisel versus the Unorthodox. There's a Netflix series about Hasidic Jews, and Rucka will be talking about that. I'm looking forward to hearing that one. Rucka, of course, knows much more, having been born and at least partially raised in Israel before coming to the States. That's going to be interesting. Tomorrow it is Book of the Year. Again, we do our Book of the Month series, but for the end of the year, what the book that had the most impact on you all year? Spoiler alert, I will be talking, as I did once before, about Martha Beck. That's going to be good. And also on Friday, TDO, the Year in Review. That's going to be great. The only other year in review that I always take in is Dave Barry. Always funny. And he's great at reminding you that there was news that happened in February or in April or in some random month of this year that was so important that has nothing to do with anything right now. And you realize, 90% of the news of the day, you shouldn't be getting all caught up in. It's irrelevant. And the things that do matter, of course, we get those reminders, but I want to hear the Daily Objectives version, the Year in Review. That's going to be good on Friday. James, we have had so much fun, but also so many insights, but also inspiration. And as you say, maybe I have had, but I know you have had impact that you don't even realize. Thank you so much for a year of Peikoff Fridays, Peikoff Wednesdays. I always say at the end of the show, but I really want to emphasize this time, we ain't done yet. No, this party goes on. James, I deeply appreciate everything that you've given me the opportunity to co-host your insights and to make this show happen. Huge shout out to all the supporters in the chat and to the man behind the scenes. We've had more than one producer, but Daniel, I know, is sitting at the control desk right now and making it all happen. But James, you are the star to me.
Well, thank you very much for that. And I do want to give a shout out to Daniel too. Daniel Krause has done an outstanding job. Thank you, Daniel. I want to thank all the listeners this year to all the programs that the Ayn Rand Center UK has put out. You guys are helping change the world, in my view, changing my world for the better. So I owe each and every one of you who've watched, hit like, hit subscribe, hit join, have contributed money, especially to those super chat people. And you can still hit thanks chat afterwards if you see this on record. I want to thank each and every one of you. You're helping my life, and I think you're helping your own life in the long run. So thank you, thank you, thank you.
Yes, and one more quick thanks to Daniel for your super chat. Very much appreciated, and especially to Jeff Bannister for that. Again, it says it's his end of year contribution. That is, for most of us, a whole year's worth of contributions and then some. Very much appreciated. And as you say, James, Most folks listen to this show after the fact, not live. So that super thanks option is available to you as well. If you want to send a few dollars to the Ayn Rand Center UK and help us keep doing what we do, as I say, we ain't done yet. James, thank you so much. Everybody have an outstanding new year. Looking forward to more in 2022. And we'll see you in 1 hour at the Daily Objective. Be well, everyone.
Take care. Happy New Year.